Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Voss, Dragon of the Southern Tier. I'm happy to be here with you today with some lighter political news because it's quite interesting. It's about Kamala Harris, Dan Quayle. You may be surprised at the comparison because I know I was. But before we get to the comparison, let's first mention that if this is the first time that you are joining us, we want to welcome you to the program. We do long-form political commentary here, and every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you, speaking to you on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, DLive, all the social media that the internet overlords will allow to hear what you have to say about the issues that affect us all, because we believe in the First Amendment, the right to free speech, not just for Americans, but for everyone around the world, because it's an inalienable right, even if governments don't always agree, and internet overlords for that matter. But let's get to the issue at hand today, because we saw something that was quite interesting, and it kind of threw us for a moment. You may have seen this yourself. We saw this from Daily Wire, although we had also seen this in a piece by The Telegraph over in the United Kingdom, and it's stating that Kamala Harris is the most unpopular vice president in 50 years. That's quite a statement. And this is according to polls, of course, and this is going off of the LA Times, which reported that on July 20, that as of July 27th, 45% of registered voters had a favorable opinion of Kamala Harris, and 48% had an unfavorable opinion of Kamala. Now, that's a pretty strong unfavorability after 6 months in the first term of an election, of a presidential cycle. And it's a pretty strong statement. And similar numbers were found on YouGov tracking polls as well. And the Telegraph is mentioning that that Mike Pence was doing much better because the current consensus overall is always comparing the current executive office to the prior executive office to see what they did in their time. But we found it quite interesting because it's a provocative title. 50 years. 50 years. That's basically our lifetime. That's going back a long way. And we did hear a similar story back on Sunday. When we were doing our live stream, we saw that WION had mentioned that Kamala Harris was underwater, that she was the least popular vice president since the 1970s. And that's a really strong statement. Now, we aren't familiar with WION, and so we wanted to look into this. And in fact, we looked into the Daily Wire article, and we saw that this is based on the LA Times poll, which came out today, August 2nd. And in this, again, it does state that she has a 48% unfavorable opinion. And you can see it here in the poll. If you notice, they mentioned the inauguration, and they mentioned the controversy about her trip to Mexico and Guatemala. What they don't mention is anything that happened in between there, such as the fact that back in February, Kamala Harris was tasked with the immigration in the southern border and the illegal aliens crossing the United States border, and her inability to do anything about it, which is why we started seeing in April when we had some 30,000 unaccompanied minors, children who were being abused, being sent on 1,000-mile trips into the United States, into the desert by themselves, accompanied by sex slavers and drug cartels. God knows how many of these children never made it to the United States. And so that's when her favorability, when Americans were saying we need to stop that, it started to fall down. Her controversy in June with her trips to Mexico and Guatemala to try and find the root cause of why people were trying to illegally enter the United States. Why are they becoming illegal aliens? The answer, which everyone in the universe knows, is America is free and wealthy. And of course, living as a second-class citizen in the United States is better than living in Guatemala or El Salvador or many other places around the world. So not a surprise that her unfavorability continued to go up. But also in this chart, they wanted to take a look at several past vice presidents. They looked at Joe Biden, Mike Pence, Dick Cheney, and Al Gore. But that's not telling us all the story. It's also not going back 50 years, which even going back to 1997, we're talking over 30 years. Even then, the LA Times did not want to point out how badly she was doing and trying to give her a very positive spin. One of the things that we noticed that was really interesting in the LA Times article is this is the favorability and unfavorability rating of Kamala Harris over time. And if you notice, she never started off as being very popular amongst Democrats as she was seeking the presidential bid for the Democratic Party. And when she dropped out, she had a favorability that was in the mid-30s, well, actually low 30s. She was never very popular, and as she had run for president, she never made it to 40%. But her unfavorability absolutely did, and in fact reached as high as 45%. And then it dropped down once Joe Biden had gotten the ticket and said he was going to pick a black person to be his, black and woman, to be his vice president. Well, that kind of narrowed the field, and obviously her favorability shot up on that basis. She got the nomination, joining the ticket, which moved up her favorability, but really hadn't affected her disfavorable opinions, which remained exceedingly high, and almost as high as when she was running for president, when Democrats weren't favoring her. And then we see that with the inauguration, the election and inauguration, she reached the peak of her popularity and has been decreasing since. We took a look at this because you'll see, there's a lot of people who had some questions about this. And I'm going to get into that. But it's important to understand that most recently, and it wasn't long ago at all, that it was Kamala Harris was, and I believe it was in June, here it is. It was just in June, the week of June 26th to June 29th, according to a YouGov poll, she was at 51% disfavorable, unfavorable. And this was followed up the week after that, July 3rd to July 6th. She had a 50% unfavorable opinion. She has a very, very high unfavorable opinion for Kamala Harris. People don't think she's been doing well. And this is pointed out because if you look at Iranian news, yes, this is the Iranian newspaper Tasnim news agency, which is an Iranian newspaper. They don't like America. They don't like Americans. And I see that they found her to be unqualified. In fact, on their April 27th, 2021 article, they note that according to Rasmussen reports, 41% of likely U.S. voters see Kamala Harris as not at all qualified for the responsibilities of the presidency. 9% believe she is not very qualified. Now, that's a strong statement. And it's interesting because there seems to be no poll and no results that are asking, is Kamala Harris qualified? Even when we go back and look at what the New York Times, the LA Times, we don't see anyone asking the question, is she qualified? Because when she was running as a Democrat, when she was a senator and running as a Democrat looking for the nomination, she never garnered the approval or convinced Democratic voters that she was qualified to be president. In fact, when she dropped out of the race for the 2020 nomination on December 3rd, she had peaked at 5% of Democrats' interest in her as a presidential candidate. So it was very interesting to see that here it is, Iranian news is putting out this poll. So we had to look for it. And what we found was this article, which came out on Newsweek. It was on April 29th, where they were comparing the first 100 days for Kamala Harris and for Mike Pence. And while this was going over the favorability, and many people were saying they had about a 49% approval, a favorable opinion of Kamala Harris, which is very similar to that seen for Mike Pence, and very similar unfavorable numbers, depending on whether you're looking at Fox News, CNN polls, YouGov, the different ratings that are out there. What we find in this article, right at the bottom, buried at the bottom so that you wouldn't notice it, is that a separate poll, acknowledged by Newsweek from Rasmussen Reports, found that things are worse for Harris. That in their survey, 51% of likely U.S. voters had an unfavorable impression of Kamala Harris, and 46% had a favorable one. In addition to that, the poll showed that 50% of respondents said that Harris is not qualified to become president. Half of the people who took the Rasmussen poll fully said she's just not qualified to be president. Now, in April of 2017, Rasmussen found 63% of voters said that Mike Pence was qualified to become president. And here Newsweek adds in a bit of an editorial statement, which is very interesting. They editorialized and mentioned, however, Rasmussen has been accused by many, though they don't name who, many other outlets over the years for having a conservative bias in its surveying. If this were not editorializing, they would mention which service they're talking about. Who are they talking about? Who has said that this outlet has a conservative spin? Because they were more than happy to mention Fox News polling, the YouGov polling, they mentioned CNN polling, but they're not saying any of those have ever claimed that Rasmussen was conservative. Now, I find this interesting. I find it important because this is actually worse than what was found by Iran. And it's unique in that no one else has ever asked the public, it seems, as far as we can tell, anyone asked the public, what do they think about Kamala Harris? Is she qualified or is she not qualified? But again, I want to go back to this first thought that came up, and it was mentioned by Daily Wire, and we see it was mentioned by WION and confirmed by the LA Times, that there hasn't been a vice president that is as unfavorable as Kamala Harris. That she has been the most unpopular in 50 years. Well, many of you may be too young to know this. I'm a little bit older. So back in 1992, I remembered a vice president who had become very unpopular. And part of that lack of popularity was because of this event. Now, this is Vice President Dan Quayle. He served under President Bush Sr., and this is a moment that has lasted it's become infamous. Let me show you.
Potatoe. Make sure you always eat it before the potato. Very good.
Kids,
You gotta wait till the vice president. You gotta let him see it. Try one more time. You gotta add a little bit to the end there. Spell that again now. A little bit on the end. Think of potato. How's it? You're right phonetically, but what else? There you go. All right.
Vice President Dan Quayle made the kid put an E on the word potato so that he could have, because he didn't think he spelled it correctly. And potato is correctly spelled without the E. And this was a moment that was attacked. The far left, the left of the news media, attacked Dan Quayle mercilessly, saying he couldn't spell, and obviously that meant he was not qualified to become president. 1992 was an election year. And this is something that's carried forward. many people still consider Dan Quayle to have been a poor vice president. But if we go back, as we have, to the Washington Post, and if you're looking at the Washington Post, August 16th, 1989. So this is almost apples to apples here against Kamala Harris. And they say, Quayle still seen as unqualified to assume the presidency. I want to be clear. That's what they're saying, that he's unqualified. So in August 16th of 1989, when they ran this article, they were talking about the Washington Post ABC News poll of over 1,022 respondents. And they said 52% said Quayle was not qualified to take over the Oval Office, and 38% said he was qualified. Now, Kamala, as we went over, 50% said she's not qualified. But that's not really the question that's being asked. But that would mean that she's almost as bad as a vice president who couldn't spell potato. But it gets a little bit more interesting, because when you go into the article and you look at some of the other poll findings, 43% of those questioned approved of the way Quayle is handling his job, compared to 22% who disapproved. So Quayle, a man who could not spell the word potato, a man that 52% said was not qualified to take over the Oval Office, only 22% of the people disagreed with him. Now, you can look at any of the polls that are out here. Every single one of them will show you more than 22%. In fact, the LA Times, which is a left-leaning publication trying to make her look as good as possible, acknowledges that fully since early in 2019, and since that time, there has been higher than 22% unfavorable ratings for Kamala Harris. So she's worse than Dan Quayle, a man who 52% of Americans at the time, polled by the Washington Post and ABC News, both left-leaning organizations, he's still considered more popular, more favorable than Kamala Harris. That's pretty incredible. That's pretty astounding. And it just threw me off when I saw this. When asked to rate, and when they, as the article goes on, asked to rate the job that Dan Quayle, Vice President Dan Quayle, was doing as Vice President, 52% gave him a positive rating, 33% negative. So his doing his job, more than half of Americans thought he was doing his job well. For Kamala Harris, you can't find those numbers. There aren't people who feel that she's been doing a great job. When you look for it, you can't find those numbers anywhere. It's just not possible. So she's actually worse. At the very least, going back about 40 years, Kamala Harris is worse than a vice president who couldn't spell the word potato. That must make Democrats feel really, really secure in the presidency that's going on right now. I just thought it was interesting because very few people look at these things when you see, oh, worse than 50 years, worse than 25 years. There aren't a lot of people who look back. I remember going back 40 years. I remember Dan Quayle. I remember what people thought of Dan Quayle at the time, including myself. And he's still more favorable and more accomplished than Kamala Harris. If you found this to be interesting or informative, we hope that you'll like and share this. Please, most of all, do subscribe so that we can see your comments and we can spread this to more and more people to hear what they think about Kamala Harris and both not only her favorability, but is she qualified for the position she has as vice president? We look forward to seeing your comments and to see you later this week. Thank you.